You know, in concept, I think that cloud gaming can be a pretty interesting proposition, but you have to get the business model right. You have to make sure that the offer is just something really compelling. And the way Google's planning to execute Stadia is something that has me concerned. There's a couple things about it that make me skeptical for the future. There are a couple of major issues. Starting with the fact that, well, first of all, cloud gaming does depend on a stable internet connection, and I just don't feel like the infrastructure is there right now. I feel like it's a little too early to push for cloud gaming, given the stats that I've seen in terms of the internet speed that's required and all that. Internet coverage is still not quite where it needs to be. And one of the major aspects of cloud gaming is that, you can take your phone out and then pop whatever Assassin's Creed or whatever AAA game on a portable device, but as soon as you lose your 4G, 5G connection, if you move into an area where coverage isn't great, you lose the ability to play that game in a portable manner. And even for home internet, the infrastructure just isn't there. The average speed is pretty low from what I've seen based on the stats that I've found, based on research that I've done. It's just not there. And then there is also the fact that there's internet caps that people have to worry about. It's usually around 1 terabyte. And so as an example, where I live now in this area, there's no other service but AT&T, and it's just the 1 terabyte cap that I can get. There's no other option. And there's a lot of areas in the US and many other countries that are like that. And so a lot of it depends on where you're living, and it's just, it's kind of an issue that cloud gaming has to get over before it can be implemented on a mass market level. And another major issue is the fact that this was supposed to be the Netflix of games, or at least that's what a lot of people thought, but what Stadia does is just act as another storefront where you buy games individually, except those games, you're playing them on the cloud. You don't actually own them. You don't have them locally on a piece of hardware. And that's an issue. That's something that a lot of hardcore gamers aren't appealed by. Now, in this video, I want to focus on the issue of game ownership. And on the topic of ownership, a major aspect of that is that if Stadia fails, people don't know what will happen to the product that they purchased. This isn't a subscription model where you get an entire library of games for a cheap price that you pay every month. You have to buy games individually, and the expectation when you pay for individual products is that you'll get to own it somehow, right? Keep it in hardware or something. That's not the case with cloud gaming with Stadia, and that last point is particularly disconcerting to gamers who don't know what will happen to their games if Stadia fails for whatever reason, and who just want that sense of ownership and safety with their games. So on Reddit, during an AMA with Andrei Doronichev, who's the director of product for Stadia, he was asked about this. This is something that a lot of users brought up, and Doronichev provided a response that I don't think it's particularly reassuring. He said this: "We get this a lot. I hear you. Moving to the cloud is scary. I felt the same way when music was transitioning from files to streaming. I still have all my old CDs in the garage, although it's hard to find a CD player these days. The same happened to movies and photos and my docs and other files, and it's great. Games are no different. Eventually, all of our games will be safely in the cloud too, and we'll feel great about it. We have been investing a ton in tech, infrastructure, and partnership over the past few years. Nothing in life is certain, but we are committed to making Stadia a success. The games you buy on Stadia are yours to play. From day one, we'll support takeout so that you can download your game metadata, including saves, if you want to. Of course, it's okay to doubt my words. There's nothing I can say now to make you believe if you don't. But what we can do is to launch the service and continue investing in it for years to come. Exactly how we've been doing with Gmail, docs, music, movies, and photos. That's exactly what we're committed to." Okay, so I want to break this down because none of this is actually particularly reassuring. So let's start with the first sentence there. "We get this a lot. I hear you. Moving to the cloud is scary. I felt the same way when music was transitioning from files to streaming." So I want to emphasize that there's this false equivalence between streaming movies and music versus streaming video games. The big difference between these mediums is that things like music and movies are passive experiences where you're just kind of consuming the content. You're not adding anything back, and the streaming is just a lot easier to handle. Whereas with video games, the internet data requirement is a lot higher, and it affects the experience much more tangibly. So, if it takes a bit to stream a movie, it's not quite as detrimental as if an internet connection were to slow down a game because you're interacting with it and there's that moment-to-moment gameplay and interactivity. With games, you have to worry about stuff like input lag, the visual and audio quality and what have you, and the amount of streaming required to make sure all of these factors kind of come in perfect unison and is executed perfectly. That's a key aspect of playing a game. And with local hardware, that's very easy to pull off. But as soon as you start streaming, unless you have a really solid internet connection, a lot of that could be compromised. Movies and music, you just kind of sit back, watch or listen, right? The passive nature of movies and music make them very much ideal for streaming. There's also the fact that internet data requirements aren't nearly as high for movies and music, in large part because we consume those in much shorter bursts. A video game might take dozens of hours to complete, and for long-term, live services or online games, we could be looking at hundreds of hours worth of gameplay. Whereas with movies and music, movies 2 hours at a time, music a couple minutes at a time, that stuff is a lot easier to stream, and that lends itself to a streaming type service a lot better. Another factor of games that make it a much more difficult proposition for streaming is the fact that there's progression involved. So with movies and music, it's all about just consuming what the creator has laid forth. So ownership of those things aren't quite as vital, because if you're streaming movies and music, once you watch a movie once, you have everything there. You've seen everything that movie has to offer. Whereas with games, there's progression, and if everything happens on the cloud and something were to happen to that service and you were to lose access to those games, you're not just losing something that you're consuming, you're losing a lot of what you put back into that game, because that's what a game is, right? It's not just about what the director and the game maker presents, it's also about what the player puts back in through their own experiences, through the progress that they make. So with games, there's just a lot more to lose on the user's end, whether it be the time invested or the money spent in whatever in-game purchases, or the kind of the progression that they made and the unique way that they played through that. Players go through a journey that they want to preserve with these games, and if you lose access to a streaming service, then all of that is gone, because the save files and all of these things are in the data center. When you pay for a Stadia game, you're really only paying for access to the data center that contains the game and all the data. You're just you're getting a ticket. That's all it really is. Whereas with a dedicated home console, you're actually paying to download the game, or if you pay for a physical medium, you're getting the disc which you can play games with. And also, unlike movies and music, which are pretty set once they're released, games get updated constantly with new content, so players might want to revisit these games. So all in all, my take is that it is not it's misleading to treat streaming games as if it were like streaming movies and music, because they're very different types of they're very different mediums, passive versus active mediums, and that different dynamic changes how streaming affects the user's experience when it comes to consuming these things. From there, Doronichev said that it's hard to find a CD player these days to kind of highlight the antiquated nature of physical medium, I suppose. But here's the thing, it's really not that hard to find a CD player. I mean, sure, they're not as readily sold in brick and mortar stores as they were once used to. They're kind of out of fashion. This is because obviously it's a lot easier to carry around your phone and stream music from there, or just have them downloaded on your phone. Everything happens on your phone when it comes to music these days. But that doesn't mean that CD players are impossible to find, or that there aren't people who might listen to those. I mean, you go to Amazon and type in CD player or Discman, it's all there. I mean, even record players are sold these days because there's a crowd that likes the sort of the vintage nature of that. So there's options for the user. You can, stream music on your phone if you want, or you can buy the physical medium if you want to own that music and have sort of a physical element to it that you can insert into a piece of hardware and listen to music that way. Doronichev then talked about, quote, "The same happened to movies and photos in my docs and other files, and it's great. Games are no different. Eventually, all of our games will be safely in the cloud too, and we'll feel great about it." So this is another case of false equivalence. I've already talked about why streaming movies isn't the same as streaming games. Again, passive versus active experience. This goes doubly true for photos and docs, this false equivalence, because unlike Stadia's games, which are all in the cloud, at least based on what we know now, it doesn't seem like we'll be able to download games on local hardware. Photos and documents, sure, you can store them in the cloud, but you can also download them to local hardware and have ownership of those files and keep them safe somewhere, right? You don't lose access. That's a major distinction to make right there. And also, when it comes to photos and documents, the internet requirement isn't all that great because the files usually tend to be very small, whereas streaming games, I mean, that's a whole other beast, right? I mean, 35 megabits per second for 4K, 60 FPS is what's recommended for Stadia. That's a lot more than, the photos and docs and the kind of data that you need to download those. And even with movies and music, it takes a lot less to stream those than to, stream video games. Now, here's the real kicker from Doronichev's AMA. He said, "We have been investing a ton in tech, infrastructure, and partnerships over the last few years. Nothing in life is certain, but we're committed to making Stadia a success." Yeah, I'm sorry, touting how nothing in life is certain does not inspire confidence in your service. And to me, Google's commitment to Stadia's success doesn't mean much because there's this long history of Google killing off a myriad projects that they were equally committed to. So there's this website called Killed by Google, and it shows how many projects the company has killed and which ones specifically they have killed. There's 171 projects total that have been canned. 14 of them are apps, 143 of them are services, and 14 of them are hardware. And we've got everything from Google Glass, I'm sure you'll remember that, that's been killed off. Google Plus, their competitor to Twitter and Facebook that ultimately never panned out. Remember YouTube Gaming? That's been killed off as well. Google Hangouts is no longer a thing, and the list just goes on. There's a bunch of stuff here that I didn't even know about. So yeah, Google has a history of starting projects, having these ideas, and then when the going gets tough, instead of really supporting them, they just kind of let it die. So who's to say that Stadia won't suffer a similar fate, especially given all the skepticism surrounding it due to the internet speed requirements and the fact that it's not the Netflix of games, but rather just a regular old storefront, except everything happens in the cloud where you don't get full access or full ownership to a game. Which all ties back to the question that people have been asking on Reddit about whether the games we purchase through Stadia, if the safety and ownership of them can be guaranteed should Stadia not succeed, which is a valid inquiry. But Google provides no such assurance, saying that nothing in life is certain, but we're committed. I mean, that's the mantra pretty much for all of these other 171 projects that they killed off. So one bit of assurance Google did try to offer was that the games you buy on Stadia are yours to play. From day one, we'll support takeout so that you can download your game metadata, including saves, if you want to. But my question is, how will that save data work? Is it going to be compatible with other platforms, or is it just save data that's compatible with Stadia? Granted, there is a lot of headway being made in terms of cross saves, especially with online-based games. So in that sense, we might see preservation of progression in our games, just more readily available and across multiple platforms. So that's good. But you have games that are single player that might not offer cross-save functionality. And in that case, if you have a single-player game on Stadia and Stadia fails for whatever reason, what's going to happen to that save file? Is it going to be compatible? There's just so many questions about guaranteeing that what players put back into a game isn't lost because everything is in Stadia servers. And here's another question. What about Stadia exclusives? We know those are being developed. I think Jade Raymond is spearheading that division. She was formerly with EA and then she joined Google in order to make games for Stadia. If Stadia fails, what happens to those titles? At that point, it doesn't matter if you download the metadata for these Stadia titles because it's exclusive to Stadia, and if Stadia dies, those exclusive Stadia games dies with the service. So at that point, what, are players just gonna completely lose on a Stadia purchase for a Stadia exclusive? There's just so many important questions that Google is not addressing right now. I don't feel like they've really thought this through. And all they're basically saying is, hey, trust us, we are committed. Nothing in life is guaranteed, but we're committed. That's worthless, to customers who are looking for a sense of safety in terms of their purchases, who are looking to ensure that the money that they put into Stadia doesn't just go to waste should something happen to that service. They need to make sure that this isn't an inferior prospect compared to owning a dedicated hardware with games that you can own physically or digitally, have them downloaded, whatever, actually own those games. If Stadia can't provide that, then it's going to be dead on the water, especially given that it doesn't offer that Netflix-style subscription service. The only way I think people are willing to give up ownership is in exchange for, just having to pay a cheap price monthly for a huge library of games. Volume over ownership is the only way they can overcome that hurdle. That's the whole proposition with Netflix, right? You don't own any of the movies that you're watching on Netflix, but because you get access to this incredible library, people are willing to give up ownership. Same thing with something like Xbox Game Pass. As soon as your subscription's over, your access to those games get revoked as well. But in exchange, you only get to pay like 2 full-priced games worth of money every year, and you get access to like almost 200 games. And so for people who need to be more budget conscious, that might work out for them. Even though they don't own the games, the return that they get is that they can still play tons of games at a relatively low price point, even if that access eventually expires, once they decide they no longer want to pay for that subscription. And then there's the factor of movies and music and stuff like that. They're easier to consume. You consume them over the course of much fewer hours than a video game. Movies take 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Music, it's a couple minutes. Games, they can take dozens of hours. And in the case of these, live services or these games that encourage long-term gameplay, we could be looking at hundreds, thousands of hours, which necessitates long-term guarantees in terms of people being able to feel safe about buying a product on Stadia and not having to think about, okay, if Stadia goes down, will I just lose everything? It's just hard to trust right now that Stadia will be a success. I mean, other companies have tried, streaming games. They've tried this kind of service and they've failed. Granted, internet has evolved a lot over the past few years, and Google is a much bigger company carrying forth this endeavor on a much larger scale. So who knows what'll happen, but it's just hard to trust a company that has such a long history of killing stuff off, of just kind of giving up on projects when the going gets tough. And Google being so vague about some of these questions, asking for assurances, safety guarantees. Them being so kind of vague about these tangible concerns, it makes me even more worried about the future of Stadia and about whether they actually do have a tangible response or tangible plans for some of these concerns about ownership. So these are my general thoughts about the response that Duranichev provided. It's not reassuring at all. And until Google lays out a solid plan for these specific concerns, I think people will be very skeptical. So hopefully they'll, be a little more transparent or a little more direct about how they plan to handle stuff like this. But I'd love to hear what your take is on Duranichev's response and your general take on Stadia and the potential future you think the service has in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.